All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Mackenzie Vappel. I'm the educator here at the Historical Society, and I'm here to introduce our guest, Dr. Glen McDuff. So, for those of you who don't know, Glen McDuff, he was a former scientist at Glen. He received his PhD in physics at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and received his degree in electrical engineering at Texas Tech, where he was also a professor. He has a ton of experience, ranging from working at the Pentagon to being the history and science advisor for the Manhattan Project TV series. And he's actually the reason we acquired the General's car that I'm sure some of you have seen that's usually in front of the Hans Beta House, so thank you for that. So tonight, Glen will be speaking on a topic many of you are probably familiar with. We hope that all of you learned something new, though, tonight, especially those who are very familiar with the topic. He will be speaking about Project Alberta. And I'll give it to you, Glen. That's all I have.
Okay.
Welcome, Glen.
First off, can you guys hear me without the mic? No? Okay, you can hear me with the mic? Okay. Okay, I'm gonna check. But anyway, before we get started, first, I'm definitely not a Project Alberta expert. And when they called me and said, can you do something about Project Alberta? I'm like, okay. And if this presentation, I've never done this presentation, this is like brand new. Right off, it's brand new, I've never done it. I have no idea what I'm talking about, so if it really stinks, it's all Alan Carr's fault. Because he got me into doing this. So anyway, we will see if this works. So anyway, I'm going to talk to you about Project Alberta. And what Project Alberta officially was, started in kind of early 1945. But it started way before that. In fact, the combat use of the atomic bombs started before we started Los Alamos. They both started in early 1943. Here's a couple of pictures I just threw up. Most of these I have got from Leon Smith, who's up here in this corner. And we'll see Leon a little bit more. This is Will Penny. That's the famous British, he's kind of like the British Oppenheimer, Will Penny. He's hard at work there on Tinian. And Paul Tibbets, Colonel Tibbets, and then Serber, Louis Alvarez, and Bernie Waldman. It's just some kind of picture of the past for Project Alberta. So anyway, the timeline of Alberta is really long. And when I started digging into this, I found out that you could talk for days on the combat use of the atomic bomb. So it all started in June of '43, where they looked at what aircraft could carry the bomb concepts from the Berkeley Conference of 1942. So they started looking at all the possible aircraft that could carry these real big bombs. A few months later, they started test dropping Thin Man at Dahlgren, Virginia. So the first atomic bomb tests are actually in Virginia. September, John von Neumann proposed fast implosion, which ultimately became Fat Man. And a lot of things changed. And by October, they had determined the only plane available in World War II that could carry these large bombs were the British Lancaster. Well, we're not going to carry an American atomic bomb on a British plane. So they immediately decided to modify B-29s to carry the atomic bombs. And that's in October. By March, they started full-scale test drops of atomic bomb test units. And in September, they started modifying the B-29s. And at the same time, Wendover Airfield, it's an Army base on the border of Utah and Nevada, was chosen as the site for the atomic bomb groups. And we'll see more about Wendover in a little bit. February of '45, Commander Ashworth was put in charge of surveying a site to put Project A. And in March of '45, they officially established Project A. After 2 years of work, now they're going to put somebody in charge. Most of the test drops were started from Wendover, and they tested right up until the end of the war. So it started officially in 1945. Captain Deke Parsons was put in charge. Norm Ramsey was in charge of delivery. Commander Francis Birch, and make note, it's Commander Francis Birch, because his group was run differently from all the other groups in Project Alberta. Kenneth Bainbridge was in charge of implosion. Robert Broad was the fusing and most of the electronics. And then George Galloway was just general engineering of getting the thing put together. Now, there were a lot of people involved in Project Alberta, and Project Alberta had implications of sites all over the United States. There's two big ones. The first was Wendover Airfield, codenamed W-47. So if you start looking in history, you'll see W-47 a lot. That's Wendover. Inyo Kern, which is a place halfway between Inyo and Kern in California, was called Camel. This is where a lot of the test bombs were made, what they call the pumpkins. The Mayor's Naval Yard in California was a storage area, so was Port Chicago. Okay, I forgot what Kingman did. Of course, Washington, D.C. has to be involved. That's codenamed Mulatto, when you read a lot of the old documents. Hawaii was also a halfway point and storage area for Project Alberta. Santa Fe was, of course, in charge of Los Alamos. San Francisco was, surprisingly enough, in charge of Wendover. Iwo Jima, which had two names, Morgue was one of them, was a halfway point between the base and Japan. And we'll see the important parts of Iwo Jima. Guam was a backup in case they blew up Tinian. Guam was going to be a backup airfield. We had us, Los Alamos, Site Y. Hanford was very involved, Site X. And the most important, besides W-47, was Tinian, and they called that destination. So that was the code word used. And there were literally 100 manufacturers involved in getting ready to use the bombs for combat use. Here at Los Alamos, we had three main divisions that worked on it, G, X, and O. The gadget division was weapons physics. X was the explosives for Fat Man. And O was kind of delivery, how do you deliver this weapon? So, in other words, G and X were to make sure the bomb worked, it would explode. But they had nothing to do with arming or fusing, or the case design, or the aircraft, or how to handle it, or how to assemble it, or loading. And a very important part, protection against attack, which they learned the hard way, which we'll see in a minute. So anyway, Wendover, what was their primary job? Their primary job was drop testing and to develop ballistic tables for the bomb so that the bombardier could program the bomb sights to release the weapon. They chose it because it's in the middle of nowhere. And in fact, Bob Hope, on one of his USO tours, said they should change the name from Wendover to Leftover. Evidently, this was not a really high-class place. Leon Smith spoke of it frequently, but it was the home of the 509th and the 339 Bomb Groupment. And what they did here, besides the ballistic tables, were develop most of the arming and fusing and most of the electronics that carried the bomb that would detonate the weapon in a combat use. This was the takeoff point for most of the test flights. The terminus point was at Sandy Beach, right close to the Salton Sea in Southern California. I'll give you a quick Leon Smith story. And we'll see a picture of Leon here in a minute. Leon said they flew down to Salton Sea. We're going to do a test drop. Something went wrong, so they had to land. They were going to do it again the next morning, so they landed. They're going to spend the night at Salton Sea. Secrecy was really a big deal back then. And he said two of the guys that were with them decided, let's sneak over to Tijuana tonight. And then we'll get back before they catch us to find out we're gone. You know, because we've been at Wendover and we can't leave Wendover. The military could not leave the base. You fly in and you fly out. You do not leave. So they snuck out that night. Leon said, I don't know if they caught him going out or coming back, but we never saw those two guys again. So anyway, the real effort there was to take our science fair project and turn it into a real usable science fair project. That's something that would survive dropping out of an airplane. To make these things combat ready. This is back then, Commander Ashworth, now Admiral Ashworth, talking about some of the work going on at Wendover.
The design of the Fat Man bomb was really pretty difficult to do. Somehow you had to make this into a ballistic shape that would produce reproducible flight, and from which you could get your ballistic table information to work on your bomb sight. And so it's almost like a streamlined brick. It's one of the worst things you can have.
Test bombs resembling Fat Man are called pumpkins. They're loaded with conventional explosives and drop tested in the California desert. Early models tumbled badly and missed the target by miles. Finally, a new design with a box-shaped tail is tried. It works, to the surprise of the cameraman on the ground.
A man named Brookston, he was, for some reason, unable to leave the whole bombing range at the time that there was scared come over. So I said, well, they've been missing by so much that the safest place would be the bullseye of the target. So that's where he went, and this bomb came down and was headed right towards the bullseye. So fortunately, he had time to get spotted and had time to get blown out of the way.
That was just interesting. There were lots of problems with that. Little boy basically had no problems whatsoever. It looked like a bomb. It flew like a bomb. It was very little effort. Fat Man was different. But the whole program of the aircraft to handle this was called Silver Plate. That was the code word. If you had this code word, you got anything you wanted in the military. They would kick, in fact, in one case, Leon said, they kicked a colonel off of a flight to put a corporal on, which rarely happens in the military because he was part of Silver Plate. But the Silver Plate was very, very restricted. There was about 1,000 people at Wendover, plus or minus some. Probably 99% of them had no idea what they were doing there. They did not even tell the bomber crews that they were going to drop an atomic bomb. And in fact, most of the time at Wendover, there were only six people who knew what was actually going on. It was Colonel Tibbetts, of course, he's in charge, head of security, head of the base operation, and the 3 electronic test officers. Leon would always say, you don't even mention the word atomic. You say atomic, and you're going to be in the Aleutian Islands hopefully just till the end of the war, if not for the rest of your life. But he said it was very, very, very strict. But the electronic test officers, here they are. This is Dick Jepson, Phil Barnes, and Leon Smith. These 3 guys were chosen to basically arm the bombs on the combat missions. They also were the ones who designed most of the fusing system. The timers, the switches, and we'll see more of that in a little bit. Dick Jepson was the Hiroshima. He was on the Little Boy mission. Phil Barnes was on the Nagasaki mission. And I asked Leo, where were you, Leon? He said, well, I was on Iwo Jima for both missions, where the backup plane was. I said, why were you there? So I drew the short straw. So. Fortunately, Leon was a test officer on Crossroads Able, our next atomic detonation. But a lot of the stuff they did at Wendover was the electronics, like making sure the Archie radars worked. Fat Men and Little Boy both are radar triggered, and they used Archie radars. Archie radar was a very, very common radar. Every airplane in World War II that did not have a tail gunner had an Archie radar. These are tail warning radars. It's basically a rearview mirror for airplanes that don't have, you can't see out the rear. We looked at production records of these. They were producing these at about 120 a day here in the United States. So it was very easy to get, very easy to use. But what the electronic test officers designed were timing, clocking, delays, and this is the Fat Man, what they call clock box. In the clock box, they have delay timers, relays, switches, filters. They added the Fat Man because Fat Man flew so bad, they were afraid that if they armed it when they dropped it, if it turned over, it would see the airplane and detonate because it's radar triggered. So they added these first 3 timers, which was the first time a bomb had a safe separation timer. So when the bomb released, for the first 15 seconds, nothing happens to get the bomb far enough away from the airplane that it won't trigger on the airplane reflection. And then it has some more timers, and so as the bomb falls, different functions of the arming system would turn on. They had the arming plugs. You've seen them over at the museum, the little green and red plugs. That would also go through a timer, and this is a test unit where you could test to be sure the plug is working, and also test to be sure the timer is working. You can see here this little wire simulates a pull-out wire that's on the top of the bombs. So they developed all of this circuitry. They have the battery. Fat Man and Little Boy both ran on lead acid, basically car batteries. Barrel switches, which were made by Boeing, these were switches that as the bomb changed altitude, they would either open or close, depending on what function was required. And so the bomb would fall to 18,000 feet, and this would allow power to radars. And they would fall to 12,000 feet, and it would connect antenna signals to the radar, or whatever the functions were at the time. So things kind of stepped on as the thing got closer, and by 5,000 feet, the bomb is completely armed, and all it's doing is looking for the ground. They had the famous test box. Now, Leon designed most of the test box. This box worked for both Fat Man and Little Boy. When connected to the bombs, they could basically test every function of the weapon. They could test all the switches, status, they could check the battery voltage, dynamotor voltages, make sure the radars are working. And this allowed them to actually fire the bombs in the airplanes on the way to Japan to be sure something didn't quit. They were really paranoid. Leon said they kind of worried that this wasn't going to work. And this is kind of a big deal. They just spent $2 billion to build a bomb. Here's just a picture of one of the bombs. This is actually a drop test. Don't know if they just drop it on that platform. The picture said drop test at Wendover. I thought, well, that's cool. So now you've all seen the drop test at Wendover. So they had to improve Fat Man. At Wendover, they found out that if Fat Man hits the ground and it has explosives in it, it detonates. Or actually, if it hits anything, drop from 30,000 feet, it detonates. And they had built records show 486 Fat Man cases, consolidated steel, and centerline in Detroit. But they had this problem that, if it hits the ground, they also found that if flak, anti-aircraft, hit the bomb, it would set off the high explosive. Well, this would be kind of bad if they're flying to Japan and get attacked by something and it blows up. It ruins the bomb. So, kind of the last minute, they designed a whole series of cases made of armor plate, which is basically bulletproof, flak-proof. These were only delivered to Wendover and thus to Tinian. And this was to build the bombs out of armor plate, which later came back and bit them. But they were kind of cutting this close. The very first full-up Fat Man test drop with everything, explosives, detonators, radars, all barrel switches, just as a combat unit would be used, was on August 4th, 1945 at Wendover. On August 8th, they dropped a full-up test unit on Tinian. And the next day, they dropped the real McCoy on, this is kind of cutting it close. You know, you wait till, the last 5 days to actually test this thing to see if it's going to work. It did, fortunately. But what dropped these? The aircraft. Well, they started working on pressurized high-altitude bombers way back in the United States, way back in the 30s. Early 1940, they started the B-29 program. And the first test flight for B-29s was in 1942. They were built kind of a lot of places, at the Boeing plant in Washington, Wichita, Kansas, and the Martin plant in Omaha. Then they decided to build a special collection of silver plate bombers. Now these were very special bombers designed just to carry atomic bombs. First thing they did is they stripped everything unnecessary out of these planes, which knocked off 7,000 pounds. They also, being lighter, it gave them a lot bigger turning radius, which was very important when they released an atomic bomb. They had to get out of there really quickly. They also were the only B-29s that had variable pitch propellers. All other B-29s had fixed propellers, so they could only go forward. These bombers could actually back up, which Leon had very funny stories about that. They took off the gun turrets on the top and bottom of the plane and left only one tail gun because in case somebody came up behind, they had to shoot at them. So anyway, these were very special bombers. Where did they go? Well, they went to Tinian, an island in the northern Marianas. A couple of reasons they picked this. The main reason is they had the world's largest air base built here. Had 4 runways, about 2 miles long each. It was home to about 900 B-29s, so a few more, probably no one would notice. The Project Alberta had a little corridor which was available. There was enough space to build Alberta over in the corridor of the pond. And at the time war ended, don't really know how many Fat Man bombs there were, because Fat Man bombs were shipped as pieces. A nose, a front elliptical, a rear elliptical, and a tail. And each one of these came in a separate crate. And they were stored in the warehouse down on the docks. There were 16 little boys. They came kind of pre-assembled. But on August 1st, 1945, records show there were 3 weaponized Fat Mans and 3 weaponized little boys ready for combat use. Admiral Ashworth once told us he thought there was probably 50 to 60 Fat Man cases in storage on Tinian. He said he didn't really know because they were piled up to the ceiling. So anyway, Tinian is down here, right here, Tinian. Way up on the other end is Japan. And we were talking to Kermit Behan once. He said, this is a great place to fly from, because if the weather's clear, you need no instruments. So you get up high enough, you can see all the islands, and you just follow that arc all the way to Japan. So you can't get, he said you cannot get lost. You can't be that bad of a navigator. So about halfway to Japan, we had Iwo Jima. We'll get back to Iwo Jima in a second. But Tinian had 2 main areas, the airfield up at the north end, and then the harbor, which is kind of down midway. That's the only deep water harbor on the whole island. The rest is an old coral island, and the entire island is nothing but rock shore except for one little teeny beach. The north end had the 4 big runways. They had the atomic bomb pits, and then the 509th lived here, and we'll see some better pictures of where actually Project Alberta was. That's a picture of the airfield, to give you some idea. That's the Leon Smith picture. He said at this point there was about 900 B-29s here. He said they would start, he said you've never seen anything impressive. They would start taking off in the morning. By the time the last plane took off, the first plane would be returning from the 2,200 mile trip to Japan. So they would be a continuous line of these airplanes. This is normal B-29s, so they were just lined up row after row after row of the standard B-29 bombers. Here's a picture of a postcard from World War II of the Tinian Air Base. And this is the main area for Project Alberta. That's the Project Alberta work site over here in the corner. This is looking kind of north. That's the bomb assembly buildings. There was 3 of them, one for Little Boy, one for Fat Man, and one for all the test bombs. And then there's the famous loading pits. Because the bombs were so big, they had to put them into a pit to raise them up into the B-29 because B-29s basically sat on the ground. And then the silver plate bombers parked in this little area here. And the rest of the bombers would park on the rest of the airfield. An interesting thing that none of the 509th bombers were marked with the 509. In fact, there was no 509th markings. So they were marked like the other airplanes. And Leon said one day they were out to get ready to do a test drop, and they got everything set that night. Went to mess, went to bed, came out the next morning, and the tail markings on his plane had been changed. Because they would change these just randomly so that no one would ever know exactly who these planes were. After the war, of course, they had to put pictures on all the airplanes, like Enola Gay. And being Army guys, and being in Project Alberta, and most of these guys had not left an Army base in a year, you will notice that the names tend to have things to do with atomic stuff, secrecy, women, and toilet humor. I know you find this shocking, but like some pumpkins. Of course, that's a reference of the pumpkins that they dropped in test bombs, of course. Had strange flush, or straight flush, toilets, strange cargo, because for most of their career in the 509, they had no idea what they were doing, just dropping big, heavy bombs. Top secret, because everything they did, they couldn't tell anybody about it. The Great Artiste was the one kind of odd one. This is Louis Alvarez's plane. This is the diagnostic plane. This is the only plane that flew both combat missions. This carried the yield diagnostics from the diagnostic team. Then we have Full House. I think Leon said he thinks this references that how full the Army is of themselves and what they're full of. Of course, it's an outhouse. I don't know where Lagging Dragon came. We know it's just lagging. No idea. Next objective, so we know where this one came from. So we've been here 18 months in the Army without seeing anyone. We're ready to go home and see wives and girlfriends. Necessary Evil, Up and Atom. They were real big on pinup drawings back then. And it's funny to say, the guy who drew almost all of these lived in Albuquerque after the war. He died a few years ago. Big Stink, I don't know where that came from. Box Car, this is named after Fred Box. He was a captain in the Air Force, in the Army. And he was one of the pilots. And this represents coming from Salt Lake, which is closest they could say to Wendover, to Nagasaki. And of course, the Enola Gay. Now, none of these were marked during the war. They were all painted after they dropped the second. In fact, after the war basically ended, they painted these bombers because then they could tell who they were doing, what they were doing. They had names, no paintings. And somebody asked once, how do you know that? So how did they know Nagasaki before the war? Because Nagasaki was not the intended target. I said, no. And plus the guy who painted them said, yeah, this was like a week later. Said, I stayed up all night painting planes. Whoops. I knew how to use a computer. They also had a whole fleet of, I think these are C-47. They called them the Green Hornets. And these were planes the 509th used for ferrying people back and forth to islands, carrying equipment, going back to Hawaii. It was kind of their taxi planes. Now, the Los Alamos contingent on the site had 4 main work areas. There were 4 big Quonset huts. The core assembly, the arming and fusing, the firing, and then the yield measurement, Quonset hut. And each one had their own little team in it. These were very special because they had air conditioning. And I don't know if you've ever been to Tanian, any time of the year, it's 100 degrees and 100% humidity all the time. It is really a miserable place. So these were very popular areas. Now the key personnel from here, Los Alamos, and from Project Y were of course Deke Parsons. He was the head honcho. Technical director was Norm Ramsey, and Fred Ashworth was kind of the backup person for Deke Parsons. If something happened to Deke, Fred Ashworth would take over immediately. So basically everything Parsons did, Ashworth did too. The pit team was run by Charles Baker, Fat Man Roger Warner. Little boy team, Lieutenant Commander Birch. He has a big impact being Lieutenant Commander. Ed Dahl, Lieutenant Commander Ed Stevenson, Louis Alvarez in charge of the diagnostic team. Then Will Penny and Robert Serber were just there, I don't know, to be there. And then Bill Lawrence from the New York Times was an embedded reporter during this entire period. And we got a really good picture of him here in a second. Anyway, this is the pit assembly team in their building, which is the first building in Roll. That's Charles Baker and Raymer Schreiber. Phil, you've probably heard of a lot of these guys that came back to the lab afterwards. The yield measurement team with their diagnostic candidate of Harold Ague, Louis Alvarez, Larry Johnson, Bernie Waldman. This is on the back side of their Quonset hut. This is some of the yield measurement equipment that they carried on the planes. They would list the blast gauges were dropped by parachutes at the same simultaneously with the bombs. And the Louis, Harold, and Larry on the airplanes would listen to their signal. They each had their own frequency, listening to the signal and then recording blast data to measure the yield of the weapon. But the strange thing is the core for Fat Man was not in the core assembly building. They stored it in the back of the diagnostic building. Don't know why, no one asked. But it had this private guy with them all the time. And Harold forgot his name, but he said he sat with him and you couldn't go over close to the core or he'd shoot you. And they asked him once, well, can we get a picture? He said, no, you can't hold the core. I said, well, okay, if I hold it, you can hold it too. So Louis and Harold and Bernie and Larry all got their picture holding the core with the private. Here's a picture of the core sitting on the back table just all by itself with the private there, or the core's empty. Because after Fat Man, they didn't have a core. Said then they just left the core carrier. So of course, they immediately went out and took a picture of each of them by themselves with the core carrier because there's nobody there to shoot them if they touched it. That's just a typical Army, like, oh, we're done. They just walk off and leave everything. So anyway, Harold left this one has a funny story behind it. Because after the war, he had some guys in black hats showed up at his house and said, you have a classified picture. And he said, yeah. And he said, well, we want it. No. I don't know if you knew Harold. I knew Harold pretty good. Harold, you don't tell him, give me your picture. No, I'm not. So, well, let us see it. So they took it and they scraped a picture of the core carrier off and gave him back the picture. So this is Harold's picture, color picture. Fortunately, we have another picture before it got scraped off. That's Louis Alvarez holding it. All 4 of them got their picture done. But anyway, that's the famous FBI raided Harold Ague's house to get a picture of the core carrier photo. Bill Lawrence actually wrote his entire history of the atomic bomb in this little booklet for the New York Times. He's the guy who coined He's the guy who coined the term atomic age for the first time in print. And he traveled with them. Leon said he was a really tough boot, this guy. Said he was no slouch. They had a laundromat on Tinian, which is very important. That's the laundromat. Put your laundry and salt water in there, and the wind would wash it for you. And they had the top secret Japanese submarine. I have to tell you this story. Leon said they were there for quite a while, and said all of a sudden, military Army security showed up. And they were looking for this, there was rumors that there was a top secret spy submarine around Tinian. And somebody had this picture of it. It was this really bad picture, he said, showed it to him, of this super secret remote control spy submarine. So he said they didn't say anything. They let them search for a few days. And then finally told them, no, this is like Cletus and Bubba, who took these two fuel tanks, welded them together and put a little gas motor on it and a propeller and made their little boat. And that was the top secret. I guess you get bored after doing this for so long. Anyway, the assembly occurred in these buildings, and all three of the buildings looked identical. They were built by the Seabees. This is building one. This is where Little Boy was assembled. Inside, here's Little Boy. You can see here's the test box. Here's the umbilical cords, and you could hook this up and you could check all the functions of Little Boy. Just make sure he's got to be okay, everything's going to work. Same with Fat Man. Here's Fat Man again hooked up. This is actually not Fat Man. This is a test unit. But evidently they're testing radars in this test unit because this soldier is measuring the output of the radar with this wave meter. And you got the test box running. They're probably turning the radars on, checking. But they did all this testing and wiring. But one of the things I get asked a lot is what's with the Bumblebee paint job? Who knows what the Bumblebee paint job on Fat Man? Okay, I'm going to tell you what the Bumblebee paint job on Fat Man is. What happened is, Little Boy was, let me go back one. Little Boy is low voltage. He basically runs on a car battery, 12 volts. Well, they carry these bombs up to 30,000 feet, and they're turned on. Well, 12 volts at 30,000 feet is not a problem. The other problem is, this bomb is at 30,000 feet for an hour. It gets cold, because this bomb bay is open to the outside. I don't know if you've ever, again, been to the South Pacific at any time in history. If you drop something that's 50 degrees below zero, and it falls back into 100 degrees and 100% humidity, you get condensation like you will not believe. And this thing gets covered with water, inside and out. Well, Little Boy was not a real issue. Fat Man, on the other hand, had high voltage. And anybody ever drop your phone in a thing of water? And it just quits? That's what happens to Fat Man. If you drop him in water, he just quits. Nothing works. Well, if you drop it from 30,000 feet, he comes back in, and it gets condensation, and it gets in the wrong place. You have a problem. Or you have high voltage at 30,000 feet, which will arc a couple of feet, you have a problem. So they had to seal Fat Man, and they had to pressurize him. So what they did was, well, first they painted Fat Man, because when they were assembling Fat Man, the nose didn't fit. And it's armor plate, and it's held on by like 12 screws. And they couldn't get it to go back once they got Fat Man assembled. This is after they wired it incorrectly the night before. After they fixed the incorrect wiring, then the nose won't fit. So they had to go find a new nose. Well, first they tried to drill armor plate with a hand drill. Okay, that doesn't work. So they gave up, they went down to the docks, found a new nose that's not armor plate, but it's not painted. So they had to paint the nose. So while they're waiting for that paint to dry, someone, not Harlow Russ, painted a logo on the front of Fat Man nose, and we'll see that in a minute. But the first thing they did, now this is Fat Man, is they repaired the paint job of Fat Man, where they messed it up trying to drill holes in him. And notice the care they were taking in painting this, and how careful. So second, what they did is where the nose connects to the front elliptical, where the two ellipticals meet, on a real case, you can basically look inside the bomb and see the actual bomb case itself. It's nowhere close to being sealed. So, in typical Army fashion, they put over all the seals gunner's tape. Oh, hey, okay, come on, we put in gunner's tape. There we go, gunner's tape, which is what the Army calls duct tape. So they just taped up every seam on the Fat Man. But now that they got the big holes, the 1/4-inch holes covered with gunner's tape, they sprayed the tape with Gliptol, 1201, red Gliptol. What Gliptol is a really good paint, coating, adhesive, oil resistant, fire resistant, heat resistant. And the Army used gallons of this stuff, kind of a dark red color. And so they sprayed over all the tape and covered 2 inches around all the tape to seal anything they missed with the tape. I don't know if you've ever tried to put duct tape on a curve and it bunches up. Well, so now you know why they're putting Gliptol, and it's pretty thick. Gliptol 1201, red enamel. It says the all-purpose protection in every drop. Well, after that sealed up kind of the big chunks, the big holes. Tape, the really big cracks. This is the big holes. Well, that didn't get it completely airtight. So they sprayed over the red, they sprayed the tape over the red with Pliobond. Well, when they first started doing what they call cocooning, they can't see the Pliobond because it's clear. And in fact, if you want, you can go over to Metzger's and buy Pliobond right now. And see, it's kind of like a rubber cement, contact cement kind of combo thing. The military used it to glue like weather stripping on cockpits or anything needs to be stuck, they would use Pliobond for. Well, they couldn't see it, so somebody had the great idea, let's pour some ink in it. And sure enough, India ink, which they had a lot of in World War II, they poured it, mixed it up, and it mixed. So then they sprayed over all this with Pliobond. Now, Pliobond will never dry, so it will stay sticky forever. But they didn't care because Fat Man's not going to be here tomorrow, and so they could just let it be sticky all they want. But it sealed up all the little bitty teeny holes and made Fat Man basically kind of almost airtight, or at least if it leaked really slowly. There you go, Pliobond, industrial adhesive. There's the finished Fat Man hanging there. They're kind of putting the finishing touches on. And you can notice on the front of it and on the back of this assembly guide, the Fat Man logo. And Fat Man logo. There's a Fat Man logo. We'll see here. There's a Fat Man logo. And there's a pit crew, a pit assembly team logo. There is no Little Boy logo. And the reason is Little Boy was run by Commander Birch. You can't paint things on your uniform in the Navy because you're now out of uniform. Well, pit team is run by Charles Baker. He doesn't care. In fact, he probably invented the logo. Fat Man team was Roger Warren. We just paint all over it. We don't care. Because we're civilians and we can paint on our uniforms, and the captain will complain, and General Spatz, who's in charge of all aircraft in the South Pacific, will say, shut up, leave the crazy scientists alone, they're fine. So that's why there's no Little Boy logo. Everybody signed the bomb. Leon Smith wrote on there. Leon Smith was actually born in China. His parents were missionaries. And he knew a lot of people in China, and by now the Japanese had killed like 20 million, 30 million Chinese. Leon said he wrote on it, this is from all my Chinese friends, Leon Smith. A lot of people signed this. A lot has some not so nice things to say, But while they were letting this dry, not Harlow Russ painted the Fat Man logo on the front of Fat Man, and their motto for Fat Man, JANCFU. Does everybody know what snafu is? Everybody know what snafu? Well, they had so much trouble with Fat Man, they decided their new logo is Joint Army Navy Civilian Falla. Yeah, so they had a lot of trouble. They thought, they have nothing else to do while the paint's drying, so we have to do something obnoxious. So anyway, they wrote that on the front of the bomb. Anyway, now the bomb's ready to have the bombing mission. Here's Deke Parsons and Paul Tibbets briefing the crews on exactly what's going to happen. And this is the first time they actually told all the crews about the atomic bomb and showed them a movie of Trinity. Well, they had been bombing a lot. Starting in July, the 509th, they did 18 bombing missions on Japan. You know, I did 3 on the 20th, different airplanes practicing, dropped pumping, until August 6th. That was a big day. That's when they dropped Little Boy. They dropped 2 more pumpkins. And then on August 9th, they dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki. And then just to be exceedingly cruel, on August 14th, they dropped 2 more Fat Mans. And I thought, how evil can you be? You're in Nagoya, nice sunny day, you're looking up, and there's one B-29 flying over. And you look up, big silver airplane. Uh-oh, big yellow bomb falling out of the big silver air. Oh no, you know, boy, can that just ruin your day? But they were more pumpkin, and then after the 14th, the Japanese gave up, and that was the end of it. But here's a picture of pumpkins. Pumpkins were made in the United States, in Inyokern. Most of them were made in Inyokern. And then they were shipped on Liberty ships over to Tinian. So I guess if they blew up, they would sink the Liberty ship, and since we had 2,000 of them, it was okay. But he said these things came in all the time at the harbor down at Tinian. Here's a little map from the Japanese Museum of all the pumpkins dropped on Japan. We also dropped leaflets, you know, telling the Japanese, you know, in Hiroshima, leave now, because, you know, in a couple of days, it's going to be really bad. Of course, nobody paid attention. Now, what Leon did, since he drew the short straw, he went to Iwo Jima. Now, Iwo Jima has the famous big mountain on the, I think, the north end, or is it south end? Anyway, one end is a big mountain, and the rest of the island is basically flat, except the other end has these 2 kind of plateaus. And they ground these plateaus off and made runways. One of the runways, they put a bomb loading pit, and they made parking areas for B-29s. So every mission, they would take 2 B-29s and fly, 2 crews would fly to Iwo Jima and wait in case the plane had a problem between Tinian and Iwo Jima. It could land, unload the plane, get the plane out of the way, put the new plane in, reload the bomb. And said they practiced this numerous times of taking bombs off, putting bombs back on, and then flying back to Tinian. It's just as a backup. Little Boy, this is on Tinian loading. On the plane, the loading pit. The crew, you can see where Paul Tibbets is right here. And I don't remember all the rest of the guys' names. But that's their crew, this is all after the fact. Because there were no pictures before the bombing mission. There are very few pictures. This is a picture courtesy of Harold. This is the only motion pictures of the Hiroshima bomb. The photographic plane during the mission, when it got back to Tinian, developed the film and ruined it all. So they had no movies of the Hiroshima attack. Harold, fortunately, being security-minded that he is, snuck an 8mm camera on board. Actually, there were 3 of them. And take these movies. And Harold always told me, please apologize for my poor cinematography. And if you get sick from movies jumping around, you should close your eyes now. Because he was not a very good cinematographer. But this is after they landed. He said, we got back from the bombing mission. They said there was cameras and people and generals. And said it was like this giant welcoming party. This is it. Again, that was the ground. You know. That's the Enola Gay. If you notice, all these pictures do not have Enola Gay written on any of the plane. We always like to show that because anyway, he said Tibbetts got a medal from General Spatz because the Army does. Said next day we load up Fat Man. Said we reload our plane because the great artiste decided we're going to fly again. Fat Man took a lot of power, and since the plane's not on, they loaded Fat Man at night or in the afternoon, and then they had to hook up his batteries to keep him running until they got the plane started. There's the boxcar's crew. The Nagasaki photo. Now this is a military photo. The military photos of Nagasaki are way better than Harold Ague's. That's why we have really good Nagasaki movies, really bad Hiroshima movies. This is the whole class photo, almost the whole class photo of Project Alberta. Since pictures were not allowed before the bombing missions, a lot of the Alberta people had already left. As soon as they dropped it on Hiroshima, the people who were done got on the first plane and got out of there. So I said we lost about 25 people like the first day. So this is kind of most of the people. There's Roger Warner. And if you look closely, he has an illegal logo on his Army uniform. You can see here's Deke Parsons. People I recognize, Harold Agnew, a bunch of other guys are in there. But that's kind of the whole Project Alberta class photo. Other interesting Harold Agnew story, when they went to Tinian the first time, he said, you can't go as a civilian. Because if you go as a civilian and the Japanese catch you, you're a spy and then they cut your head off. If you go as a soldier, they have to kind of treat you like a soldier, as a prisoner of war, so they torture you and then cut your head off. But you have a lot better chance of surviving if so they all got to be a military person. So Harold, who is at the end of the line, said they're handing out rank. So they said they hanged out, gunnery sergeant, okay, this guy. So we got down to Harold, and said I had two choices, quartermaster corps, lieutenant, quartermaster corps, or lieutenant chaplain. Harold goes, okay, I have to be I will never pass it, I'll be quartermaster corps, which turned out to be really handy on Tinian. So if they're working in their area, they weren't really allowed to go off much, but they needed screws or bolts or something. They said, well, let's go check the quartermaster. Quartermaster is kind of like the supply house for the military. He said, let me go over to the warehouse and see if they have what we need. So he said he goes to the warehouse on Tinian, on the rest of the base, and he goes in. He said immediately everybody stands up and salutes him. Because they're all privates, You're the low-level quartermaster dude, warehouse junkie on Tinian. He's a lieutenant. Well, he found out I'm the only officer in the quartermaster corps on the whole island. And he goes, I need Phil. Oh, yes, sir. He said, do I need to fill out a... Oh, no, sir. No, you don't have to fill it out. Don't worry about it. Can I get some beer? Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. We need some beer. Okay. He said, they would give him anything you asked for. Not that Harold would do that, Not that he would impersonate an officer and take needed military, okay, he did, continually. He said after the war, now this is, I forgot what his name is. The Army has a tendency, like I mentioned before, not to really care when the war is over. If you notice the sign, this is at the mess tent on Tinian. It says, please, keep tables clear of beer bottles. So, well, Hiroshima, things kind of went downhill quickly. After Nagasaki, and next day when the Japanese surrendered, things really went downhill. And all of a sudden, all the privates and corporals were like, well, you got to clean up after yourself. No, I don't, because I'm going to be home and discharged by the time they can court-martial me. And he said the whole base just went to pot overnight. As you can see here, they obviously cleaned up the tables like they would normally do in good military. But also, if you haven't seen it, go over to the Bradbury. See the Harold Agnew brought back actual detectors, these little guys, the little blast gauge detectors from Tinian. He brought back 2 of them, gave one. He had one and Richard Garland had one, and we got both of them back and built kind of a replica looking thing to go in the Bradbury for their part of Project Alberta. But that's kind of all I have to say. If anybody has any questions, if I don't know the answer, I'll just make something up and tell you anyway. Oh, yeah.
Did you say that the actual Fat Man device, the nose wasn't armored?
Yeah, that's something typically, well, Harold Russ told us that. He said, yeah, it wasn't armored, but we didn't have time to do it. They're about to go. And so chances of them get hit in the nose is pretty slim anyway. He said it'd be okay.
So, Fat Man was painted yellow and looked like the other pumpkins that they were dropping, is that right?
We've heard several stories on the yellow paint. Most of them it's a yellow primer. It's a zinc chromate primer, and that's what Centerline painted the bomb cases so they don't rust in Detroit. Evidently, rust is an issue in Michigan. And they would paint them yellow, and so they just kept doing it.
Did the other pumpkins that were dropped in August, were they all conventional?
Yeah, all the other, well, some pumpkins were just full of grout. They're just,
So they were
just dummies. They would be the same weight, same center mass, same everything. And just to practice dropping them, because they had a real problem learning to drop these things, because they rarely hit the target. Some would have high explosive, some wouldn't. Some would have a full complement of detonators, some would have one. Some would just be for testing the barrel switches. Well, they did, Leon said, I don't know how many test drops we did. So we did dozens of test drops.
So, John Richter said that they modified the bomb bay in order to fit Fat Man in. So they must have done it on a bunch of B-29s if they had all these.
Yeah, I think, do you know how many, I think there were like 26 silver plates all total. But don't quote me on that. They modified quite a few. Little boy fit no problem. Fat Man, he needed to lose weight. They squeezed him in, but they got it to fit. So
I had a visitor to the United Department of Visitor Center where I'm a docent come in and tell me that her grandmother worked on modifying B-29s for
but it's probably there was.
And this was in Kansas, I believe.
Yeah, Kansas, Wichita is a big plant, but they also did it in Redmond, Washington. They worked on it in several places, and Nebraska.
Well, one of the things that she said was her grandmother told her that they put in gold wire in them. So they stripped out the wiring and they replaced it with gold wires instead of, I don't know.
And very possibly, I don't know why, but the big thing on the bombers were get them lighter, because they were carrying a huge bomb. Basically 2,400 miles they had to fly. It carried a huge load of fuel. And the big thing on the modification was get them light. They stripped everything necessary out of it.
Yeah, I wouldn't think that winning gold would be.
Yeah, you'd think they would have replaced it with something light.
Conductivity or the high voltage or something, erosion resistance. Anyway.
But that's, you know, we always say that if the materials is expensive or toxic, we probably use it in a nuclear weapons program. So that would not surprise me if we use gold.
No, they didn't gold like these things.
The project Alberta formally and with VJ today, and as well, did Wendover have a role in any of those later tests in the later half of the 40s? They were still kind of military-ish.
No, Wendover closed fairly quickly after that, as I understand. They packed up and basically moved the entire Wendover to Roswell. And that was, do you know, it was like late 1945, early 1946. But Wendover is just so far out from everywhere.
Well, Wendover was an auxiliary base to Hill. It was part of the Hill Air Force Base range up until the 70s or so. And it is just, you know, it's deteriorated the way you'd expect something to deteriorate over 40 or 50 years.
Yeah, I think it was like early 1946, the 509th moved to Roswell with aliens. That's where,
I forgot who told me, but I'm pretty sure that Tokyo Rose knew a lot about those tail designations. And I think there's a recording that one can still hear of her talking about.
oh, so that was a big deal. They said they would change those, you know, because the arrow means one thing and the backwards R means one. They said they would change them all the time. And just so, you know, this is a reconnaissance plane today, it's a weather plane tomorrow. And so, yeah, Leon said, he said it was kind of surprising because he said we'd only been gone like 6 hours. And we come back like, first he thought it was the wrong airplane, that somebody had taken theirs and put one in it. He said, no, it's our plane, it's just they changed the number on it and the tail designation. And they did that just, I think, because Tokyo Rose was probably why. They were really worried about spies, really worried about spies. Because a lot of the things they did with the arming and fusing, like all the radars on the bombs were tuned by a guy named Dick Podolsky. And only he could tune the radars. All 4 radars were tuned to different frequencies. And he didn't know what they were. He randomly tuned them so that they're all different and all within a band, but he said he didn't even know. So in case he got captured and tortured, he didn't know what the frequencies were. So there was a lot of stuff like that they were really worried this wasn't going to work.
When the men came back from Tinian, were they in the military or did they revert to laboratory civilians?
Oh, no, when they were like Harold Agnew,
Yeah.
he was never in the military. He was just faking it.
Oh, was it fake?
Yeah, he had a fake ID. So if he was captured, they would think he's in the military and they wouldn't kill him as a spy. If he's a civilian, he would have been killed on the spot. So they gave him.
There were 51 Los Alamos men on Tinian, right?
Yeah, everybody had a fake military ID.
Oh, it was a fake.
Fake military. Well, it's a real military ID.
Yeah, but they were basically civilians.
They were civilian. Yeah, they were being paid by Los Alamos.
California.
They weren't officially in the military. They were only in the military while they were worried about
while they were there.
While they were there.
Do you want to talk about the Japanese sniper that almost killed?
Yeah, I think Leon Smith actually talked a little about the snipers. Said there was a couple of snipers on Tinian that lived up in the hills, because once they took the island back to Japan, some of the Japs were left over, and they were still fighting the war. He said they would go down to their little beach there by the assembly buildings. There's a beach about the size of this room. And said one day they're out there and a bullet hits. I'm like, crap, somebody's shooting at us. So they go hide. And but they said they learned that if in the evening on the base, if they would go put all their garbage and old food outside the fence, at night the Japanese snipers would come down and get it to eat because they're starving to death. They're living in the cave. They said as soon as they started doing that, they quit shooting at them. He said they put out their garbage, and then the next morning it'd be gone, and they wouldn't get shot at. So once they started feeding the guys, they kind of slacked off. But they were always worried when they go outside that somebody might shoot them. Also, before they got there, when they were building the island, the Seabees, who built the island with bulldozers, they don't have guns. The naval part, they don't give them bullets, guns. And evidently a sniper shot some Seabee off of a bulldozer and killed him. Well, this upset the Seabees. Well, they don't have guns, but they do have gasoline. And they took all the gas trucks up on the hill and they flooded the tunnels with gasoline and lit them on fire. They said that slowed down the shooting for a while. They said, but the garbage worked really well on just putting all their old food and garbage out. And but no, a sniper was a real problem. This is a combat zone.
If anybody wanted to see some more footage, over at the Beta House on the TV, the DVD loop has footage from the Hiroshima flight.
Yeah, and well, also, I think if you go to Alan Carr's YouTube page, we have about 2 hours or hour or so of Tinian footage, a ton of Tinian footage, a bunch of Trinity footage, and he's got it all posted. So that's, if you're curious on watching silent films, not taken by Harold Agnew, so they're actually not bad. I'm sorry, Harold, but we have to make fun of you too.
And the footage over there includes what they took when they were preparing to fly out at 2:30 in the morning on the 6th. They have, Groves had told them to be sure to document it. And so they've got the crews.
Yeah, definitely. Watch these. These are really cool films. In fact, we've actually discovered some more just the other day that we didn't even know existed. Because we're actually catching up with our storage at the lab. Now it's 80 years after the fact. We're finding, oh look, more Manhattan stuff. But yeah, be sure to visit the Beta House. Visit the Bradbury. So, let me see. You want another stupid story or oh?
Was Tinian out of range of any Japanese aircraft?
Oh yeah. Yeah, basically, by this point in the war, everything was out of range. Unless you were just really close. Iwo Jima was out of range of the Japanese. They had been pretty well driven back to Japan, the islands of Japan. So, yeah, I said we never, Harold and Leon both said we never worried about like air attack or sea attack. It's mainly that those dudes up in the hills. And they said once we started feeding them garbage, we had no worries.
What did you mean when you said that the Lancaster bomber was not an acceptable option?
I think it's because Americans are snobbish. It's kind of the same reason why our rocket program did so poorly in the early days, because Eisenhower said, we're not putting an American in space on an effing Nazi rocket. Because the Nazis were at White Sands developing rockets. Our rockets didn't work, theirs worked fine. And ultimately, von Braun put a dude on the moon. So, no, it was just, they weren't going to use a Lancaster bomber. You know, it's like,
There was another thing about the Lancaster. It went slower, couldn't go as high. So although it could carry the bomb, the chances are the crew would not survive if they dropped it.
that's probably another good reason too. Now, I'm sure the crew, oh,
But the Lancaster was a good excuse. Anytime they were in discussions about B-29s, they'd say, well, we'll have to use a Lancaster.
yeah.
And the B-29 people would say, oh, no. So it worked.
Yeah, they got it to where, you know, I don't know the whole story behind it, but the general gist was, we're going to fly an American bomb on an American airplane. The B-29 is going to do
And
this.
it was a Lancaster hook and release mechanism.
It was. The hook is basically, because the Lancaster could carry the really big bomb. What was it?
12,000.
Yeah, the tall man, yeah, the tall man, tall boy?
I think so.
Yeah, tall something. And that's like, what, like a 20,000 pound bomb or something? It's a big bomb. So, but anyway, that's why. Basically, I think Boeing was going to do this. You know, come hell or high water, it's going on a
The
B-29.
problem was a B-29 wouldn't work.
Oh, the very first atomic bombs were tested with an Avenger, an ABF Avenger naval aircraft. Surprisingly enough.
And B-29 had lots of problems, lots of teething problems.
Yeah, oh, yeah, it was, yeah. The other thing, Leon said that almost every mission, well, first of all, they always lost planes because they just crashed on their own. He said he said 1 out of 2 planes coming back from Japan, the Norwood, would lose an engine because they ran those engines screaming wide open. And when I went diving on Tinian, there must be 2,000 engines on the ocean floor. Said they would come in with a blown engine, they'd take it out, throw it in the ocean, and put a new engine in. Said they went through engines, they could change one of those big rotary engines. Said in like a couple hours. Said those technicians would work on those hot engines in 100-degree heat, 100% humidity, and that thing's scorching hot, and they'd be out swapping engines day in and day out.
That continued.
They said it's just, they said you've never seen until you see 1,000 planes leave.
Even in the 60s, things that used internal combustion engines, big 4360s and the like, they didn't last.
Yeah, no, he said it was just, said it was really common for planes. Almost every other plane would have at least one engine out. They said they would crash on takeoff all the time, which is really disturbing because they'd always take off to the east because that's where the winds are going. And he said if a plane would take off into the runway and for some reason not make it and crash in the water, it would sink so fast they quit trying to even save the crews. They were just sorry, you know. Said in the early days they would try to get out there and save them. He said finally if you crashed off the end of the runway, you're not going to make it anyway. He said it's really, really tough to watch this plane just nosedive and go under. Yeah, it was not a happy time. I mean, they tried to make it a little happier, but I said no. I said it was not the whole war. Well, I said the whole war thing really stunk. So there's nothing worse than this war, and that's what they were there for. They're there to end it. So we have to end this war. One more story I just remember that Ashworth told us. You want to hear it? Okay. Because Commander Ashworth, he was commander for the Nagasaki mission, which had gone very badly. I mean, right from the start, it went bad. Right from the start, they broke the airplane, got delayed on takeoff. They finally got there. Kokura was clouded in, so he went to Nagasaki, the backup target. They had just enough fuel to make one pass, drop the bomb, and get out. But they had orders to have visual bombing only. And Kermit, who was the bombardier, knew this. So he said, we got one chance, and it's kind of broken cloud, so he was looking through the bomb bay, and he said, He said, I've acquired a target. When he acquires a target, the pilot turns command of the airplane over to the bombardier, and he basically flies the plane. All the pilot has to do is keep this little arrow straight up. That's his whole job, keep the arrow straight up. And the bombardier is going to do the rest. So he targets, they release Fat Man, they drop it, they do their turn, they make one loop because they had enough gas. They fly over and realize he dropped it not where he thought he dropped it. He thought he dropped it on the big racetrack in the middle of town. Well, what he really dropped it on is this running track kind of on the north end of town. But he saw a track through the clouds, and it was a target, visual. President Truman ordered that, visual bombing only. And he released the weapon. He thought, oh, great. I dropped it in the wrong place. Well, tough. So they head to Okinawa, the closest runway. So they're flying to Okinawa, and Ashburn said it's almost like on TV. You know, it's like, we're not going to make it. We're going to run out of gas. You know, what can we throw out of the airplane? You know, just start throwing everything out, make it lighter. Which he said we couldn't because they'd already thrown everything out of the airplane. So they're coming in, so they call Okinawa and say, you know, emergency. We're between eyes going to make a landing, and said the ground control said you can't land here. The runway's too short. And they said, we're landing there. So the captain told Ashworth, who's Navy, he said, fire the warning flares. And at the top of B-29, there's a flare gun and a little box of flares. So he said he took the flares down, and there's yellow flares and red flares and green flares and blue flares. And Air Force people know what these colors means. That I'm Navy, I don't have a clue, you know. So I'm like, well, I'll just fire all of them. So he just starts firing, you know, he puts it in, pulls the string, puts it, you know, so now they're on fire, they have wounded, you know, the landing gear won't let down. Everything that's gone wrong has gone wrong with the plane because they're signaling the ground crew with these colored flares that something's wrong, so they can be prepared for it. So they land, so the ground crew's there, they pull up, they have reversible props, so they can reverse thrust. So they slow down really quickly. They could land on a really short runway. So they land, they said, the firemen are out, like. So we get out, and the Jeep comes out to see them. And Commander Ashworth says, you know, take me to your radio shack. I need a call home. So we go to the radio tent. He knocks on the door. Said the sergeant opened the door. Said, I need to use your radio. Yeah, Navy scum, go away. Which is typical. So he says, take me to your commanding officer. He said, this is where it really gets funny. So they get back to the Jeep. They go over to the command tent. They knock on the door. And General Spatz opens the door. He's in command of all aircraft in the South Pacific. He is the Air Force commander. And he said, and he knew, and he said, you know, oh, General, you know, we just dropped a bomb on Nagasaki, and we need to use your radio. Oh, come right in, come right in. There's someone here that might want to meet you. He said, so we go through the first little tent, go into the second tent, and there's General Doolittle. You know, the 5-star General Doolittle. And he said, you know, this is Commander Ashworth. They just bombed Nagasaki. He said, really? Quick, get out a map. So he get out a map. He said, you know, here's a map. He said, where did you drop it? He goes, well, you know, Nagasaki, and Behan was there. He said, well, I fouled up. I thought I dropped it. Here's our target, but I dropped it here. So I hope I'm not in trouble. And he said, General Spatz, who's 3-star, 4-star at the time, he just got another star. He goes over, puts his hand on Kermit's shoulder, said, don't worry, son. He said, you dropped a bomb right on top of Mitsubishi Heavy Iron Works. I wanted to bomb that the entire war. And they haven't let me. He said, if anyone gives you any lip, I'll talk to Harry about this. So Kermit said, well, I feel a lot better now. So anyway, they got back to the radio shack. They got really good service this time. When General Spatz went with them, he said, oh, that guy, that sergeant, just whatever you need, I'll do. So he called home and told them we dropped the bomb. Said we got some food, gas, and then flew off. That was the end of it. But it's amazing what a 4-star general can get done. in the military. Yeah. So I hope you enjoyed this. There was a million things